Good evening. This is News Select. It's July 12, 2050. The headlines. The main news today: scientists are predicting a year of disasters on an unprecedented scale. The reason? Global warming. Predicted effects range from floods to landslides. Droughts are forecast too. The death rate from starvation worldwide is set to rise to 20,000 a week. In the next 12 months, meteorologists are predicting a death toll well into the tens of millions from weather disasters alone.
This film tells the story of a terrible year in our future. A year when the world's biggest killer is our climate. Global warming may take millions of lives. Scientists are predicting storms more savage than anything we've yet seen. Fire and flood. Destruction on a massive scale. In our future, global warming could cause up to 30 million deaths in a single year. That year is 2050. We live on an astonishing planet. A vast world. Mountains. Oceans. Immense plains. It is a world of wonders. Home to over 6 billion human beings. Our home. And we're destroying it. Scientists first began worrying in the 1980s. Freak hot summers year after year.
See large warming in North America.
They suspected it was the greenhouse effect.
It's continuing a trend that we're seeing toward increased temperatures.
But was it? Research began worldwide.
The increasing greenhouse gases. This all is consistent with an increasing number of extreme events.
By the mid-90s, the scientists were completely sure. Even world leaders were convinced.
Global climate change affecting how we and all others on this planet will live to avoid leaving our children and our grandchildren with a catastrophe.
By 1996, we knew we were changing the world's climate. We are choking our own planet. Carbon dioxide from our cars and factories, from burning and deforestation, is trapping more and more of the sun's heat. As we pollute our planet, it's becoming hotter. Already, the Earth is half a degree warmer than it was 100 years ago. What will it be like in 50 years' time? Already, our climate is changing. The recent floods in Europe have been more widespread and severe than ever. Around the world, events which were rare or distant are happening more frequently. This is what just a half-degree temperature rise can do. 50 years from now, our planet will be 5 degrees warmer. Global warming will transform our world forever.
Well, there's no question that global warming is real and that the cause of global warming is ourselves. It's the polluting activities of mankind. That is without question. On the one hand, you may have a few maverick scientists, a few groups who have their own agenda, who have their own vested interests at trying to pretend that global warming is not happening, or at the very least that it's a natural variation in the climate. But that's completely untrue. 1,000 of the world's top climate scientists have contributed to the United Nations report that says global warming is real, it's big news, it's serious, and it's the biggest threat we've ever faced.
Bill Maguire heads Europe's largest hazard research centre. He and the vast majority of scientists now believe global warming will have consequences we can barely imagine today.
Nobody is safe and nowhere is safe. There's nowhere to hide and there's not going to be anywhere we can run. In the year 2000, 1 in 30 people were affected by natural hazards worldwide. By the time we get to 2050, or maybe a little bit later on, I think that figure will be 1 in 1. In other words, everyone is going to be affected by natural hazards every year.
Good evening. The Week in Review. It's August the 15th, 2050. Just over a month ago, we reported predictions that the next 12 months would see a sharp rise in climate-related disasters. This week, the catastrophes that are already making those predictions come true. The flash floods in Italy this morning have already claimed 782 lives. The floods bring the total of weather-related disasters to 57 within the last 4 weeks. Casualties overall for the last month now stand in excess of 80,000. Fires are still ripping through California. 20,000 people have been evacuated and 200 are now feared dead. In Australia, bushfires have claimed 87 lives in the Sydney suburbs. In Africa, the aid agencies are overwhelmed. The drought in Mozambique has now killed an estimated 50,000. Then, last week, freak storms left 3 million without running water or basic sanitation. These storms aside, this is their 4th year without rain. The drought looks set to continue.
How can we prepare for a future where the only certainties are chaos and constant disaster? There are places today where we can glimpse what tomorrow may hold. Doug Kopp is today's foremost rescue engineer.
Process bacteria. And then we say here, 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 here. But no more disinfectant.
His job is to take apart the wreckage left by a disaster and search for bodies, or, if he's lucky, for survivors.
11.
He has witnessed the horrors all of us may face in the future. In a sense, global warming is already a reality for him.
If someone was to ask me, Doug, we want to film a disaster, or we want to see a disaster, or we want something to do with a disaster, where do we go? And I would say, well, look, your best bet is to go to Peru, because they are beaten down continuously every few months with one disaster or another.
Peru is plagued by El Niño, a weather event that hits once every few years, when a current in the Pacific Ocean suddenly changes direction. Whenever it strikes, it causes certain, irresistible and global disaster. The world is racked by floods, fires, storms and droughts. El Niño hints at the horrific future that may await us all, not every few years, but all the time.
Escuchamos un ruido demasiado fuerte.
We heard a loud noise, and from the direction of Simbal, we saw an avalanche.
Hemos hizo que un alud,
sludge, mud, rocks. It dragged along animals, trees,
animales, árboles,
ripped away all the houses.
Before we rebuilt, all this was in ruins. It was a disaster. Houses, gardens, everything.
Todo esto que hizo acá son zanjas que han hecho.
All of this was in ruins. The El Niño flattened everything.
This is what global warming may one day do to us all. These ruins near Trujillo in the north of the country were left by a flood during the last El Niño. This, now a wasteland of rubble, was home to hundreds. In this single village just 3 years ago, more than 90 people died.
In the village that we visited, with a huge area of total and complete destruction, with even foundations gone, nothing left except a ring of debris that floated in from the river, and the traces of roads running through it. That was completely devastated, completely destroyed. Surrounding it are homes in half rubble. Next El Niño in 3 months' time, they will be completely destroyed.
These images were filmed during an El Niño event in 1998 and 99. More than 20 natural disasters hit the country in less than a year. Flash floods and mudslides killed 2,000. Just as global warming brings the certainty that disasters will strike us all, so here they know that the next El Niño is never far away. Now, 3 years later, it's another El Niño year.
I think El Niño is an excellent example of what we might expect to face in the future as global warming really gets going. And when an El Niño develops, it has a knock-on effect across the whole planet, from sort of blizzards in Peru to floods in Central Europe to drought in Africa, drought in Australia. It has a global impact. And in that sense, El Niño can be regarded as a small example of what we can all expect.
Except global warming will be far worse. Its effects will vary widely, but science can already tell us what our future holds. The seas will warm. At the poles, the ice will begin to melt. Sea levels around the world will rise. In warmer countries, the cycle of dryness and rain will become ever more extreme. As more and more heat pumps into our atmosphere, crippling droughts will be followed by devastating floods. Entire cities will find themselves underwater. Everywhere, storms will become more savage and more intense. Nowhere will be safe. Even life in paradise is under threat. In the Bahamas, they have already experienced what warmer sea temperatures can do. Here, just like Peru, the last El Niño caused destruction. But here it was not lives, it was coral. Coral reefs are among the richest ecosystems on our planet. Environments so diverse and complex that so far we've only learned a fraction of what there is to discover. And before we can learn, many of the world's reefs may have vanished. If the oceans warm, the coral will die, and we have almost no idea what the consequences might be.
This reef here used to be a healthy reef up until about 1998, when there was an El Nino event which caused sea surface temperatures to rise only about a degree or two, but that was enough to cause the corals to expel the symbiotic algae that live inside of them, which gives them a lot of their food. And after doing that, it was so severe that these corals died, and now they're about 90% dead corals here, where there used to be about 90% live corals.
Sea temperatures here rose just 1.5 degrees for just 2 weeks. It killed almost all the coral. All that remains are these dead structures, devoid of color, almost completely devoid of life.
A lot of the corals were affected. They were bleached white. Many of them recovered. Other ones are still in the process of recovering, so we're just starting to see the regrowth process occur here. In some places the corals aren't able to get a foothold yet because there's algae and other things that have taken over where there used to be coral. So it's likely to take decades, if not longer, to recover.
But if the coral needs decades to recover, then its future is bleak, not just in the Bahamas, but everywhere. Global warming is predicted to make sea temperatures permanently warmer. That will kill the coral permanently. And if the reefs vanish, countries will lose more than just a natural wonder. They will lose their main defense against the sea.
The reefs are an important barrier.
future, it's possible that nowhere will be safe. Franco Mantovani lives in the Po Valley in Italy. 16 million live here, a third of the country's population. All of them are at risk. The danger is flooding, and the threat is from the River Po.
This is the Po River. Actually, the level is very low because we are in a dry season, but you have to think that during the rain season, the level can reach this, where we are now. On the opposite side of the Po River, you see the small village of Poleselle. As you can see, the topography is very different. The level of the Po River is higher, something like 5-10 meters of the village. And that is a very high risk, especially when we have a lot of precipitation.
50 years from now, the Po will regularly overflow its banks onto the helpless towns and villages 10 meters below. The problem is the sea. Sea levels around the world have risen 2.5 millimeters in the last 50 years. By 2050, they will be up to 50 centimeters higher. Any river, the Po included, flows down to the sea. So if sea levels go up, the river has nowhere to go. It has to flood. Worse still, the Po Delta is not just below river level, it's below sea level too. Here in the fishing port of Goro, you can only see the top floors of the surrounding houses. In Italy, even if the river doesn't overflow onto the land, the sea will. It's tempting for us all to think that there are places where we'll be safe. Look at our cities, environments totally controlled by human beings and their machines. Surely our technology can protect us. But many cities are already under attack. This is the Thames Barrier, London's last defence against the sea. When they are not in use, these curved walls rotate down into channels in the riverbed. The Thames is a tidal river. The North Sea may be 100 kilometres away, but at high tide, the river regularly fills almost to the limits of London's embankments. And when the seas are too high, driven by exceptional winds or tides, the barriers must rotate into place. They form a wall over 20 meters high, taller than a 5-story building. It blocks the sea from driving upstream and prevents the river from backing up and flooding. But the Thames Barrier is already being overwhelmed. Within 20 years, rising sea levels and more severe storms will mean the barrier has to be replaced. It will cost over £4 billion. But the alternative would be to abandon Britain's capital to the waves.
Floods across much of Southeast Asia today. The Yellow River has all but vanished over the last 18 years, but today, what's left of it burst its banks. An estimated 15 million are homeless, and Gaiju City is already underwater. More rain is forecast, and several other cities are already under threat. On top of the floods themselves, disease, toxic waste spills and malnutrition are expected to be the major problems.
Scientists have already seen our future. They know global warming will hit us hard. They know we need to act now. We could still change the future. Reducing carbon dioxide is technically possible, but someone has to make it happen. Industrialists, politicians. Scientists may have discovered the problem, but the solution is beyond their power.
I don't think that you can get the world's leaders together in a room and force them to do something about global warming. I don't think that's going to happen until those countries are hit time and time again by the results of global warming. When a hurricane hits Miami bang on and destroys a substantial part of the city, when you get drought across the central US and you have dust bowl conditions again, in other words, until it's proven to them that the world's warming up and that they're going to be severely impacted by that, they're not going to do anything. Well, that's going to be too late.
Our future is already beginning. Look around you. Unexpected floods, fires, freak storms and droughts. Even the seasons are becoming less predictable. Our own experience already tells us that the climate is changing, and science tells us that the consequences will be horrific.
I was asked a ridiculous question. Does global warming matter? Well, it matters if you want to live. It matters if you want your children to live. It matters if you want any sense of humanity to live. And it matters if you, especially if you want them to live, or some form of humanity, live in a planet and live in an environment that is not an absolute horror and an absolute hell. All the suffering that's taking place in Peru and other countries like this will be brought home to people in countries that don't know the face of horror. They'll be seeing it.
What you have been watching is not alarmist. This is what scientists believe will happen. Our own technology is killing us, our own prosperity. Even if we stop immediately, the disasters will come. If we don't stop, things could be even worse. Global warming could actually plunge the world into the most horrific freeze.
Good evening. Over 10 million cubic kilometres of near-freezing water is tonight pouring unchecked into the Atlantic Ocean. It's a disaster of global proportions. The lake draining into the Atlantic is the remains of the 2-kilometre thick Greenland ice sheets. Now it has broken through the thin walls of ice that kept it from the sea. The cold water is pouring directly into the warm waters of the Gulf Stream. Scientists fear the result is now inevitable. The Gulf Stream current will stop. It will plunge Europe into the worst freeze it has experienced for 20,000 years. And that will have global consequences. In the next 10 years, a new ice age will begin.
can see what happens right over here. The legs on the desk snap, so the person who's underneath the desk gets crushed. Meanwhile, there's still a safe space existing around the desk.
The first thing I teach every organization I lecture to is how to survive. And I'm telling you this, 90% of people who are in buildings when they collapse would survive if they got next to a large bulky object in what we refer to as a triangle of life. %90 of people who are in buildings when they collapse would survive if they got next to a large bulky object in what we refer to as a triangle of life. And essentially a triangle of life is nothing more than a survivable void that's found next to a large bulky thing.
Where his chest was crushed, and you can see what happens right over here. The legs on the desk snap, so the person who's underneath the desk gets crushed. Really simple. You get under your desk and you're dead.